The instant Shadow's paws hit the gleaming courthouse floor, Officer Jake Morrison felt it in his gut something was seriously off. This wasn't a training exercise or a false alarm, and it definitely wasn't routine. Shadow, his trusted K-29 partner of 4 years, was pulling him with relentless urgency straight into a federal courthouse right in the middle of a high-profile custody hearing. No signal, no warning, just instinct. Something inside that building wasn't right, and Shadow was on a mission. Officer Morrison's days usually ran like clockwork: briefings in the morning, precinct updates, regular patrol routes, and occasionally, a school visit if time allowed. That structure brought him comfort. Orderly, predictable, safe. But that morning broke the pattern. He had just polished off his second coffee and was cruising past the Jefferson County Courthouse in downtown Denver. It was just another stop along the route. No scheduled checks, no alerts, nothing on the radar. He had no plans to stop. Shadow had other ideas. From the back seat of the cruiser, the black Labrador mix, famous at the precinct for his precision and discipline, let out a low, uneasy whine. At first, Jake assumed it was a passing distraction, maybe a squirrel or another dog. But then the whining grew into deep, guttural growls. Shadow's body went stiff, his attention fixed. Then came the scratching, urgent, rhythmic claws raking against the inside of the canine cage. Jake glanced into the rearview mirror. Easy, partner. We're not stopping here today. But Shadow wasn't calming down. As Jake eased the car through the next intersection, Shadow let out a sharp, piercing bark so intense and immediate that Jake slammed the brakes without thinking. In 4 years, Shadow had never barked inside the car. Not once. Jake's heart kicked up a notch. He flipped on the hazard lights, pulled to the curb, and swung open the back door. Before he could secure the leash, Shadow launched out, focused entirely on the courthouse entrance. Nose low, tail straight, every muscle coiled. "What's gotten into you?" Jake muttered, clipping the leash to Shadow's harness. But the dog was already surging ahead, towing him across the sidewalk with determined strength. Inside the courthouse, everything seemed normal. The usual buzz of voices, fluorescent lights, humming, security scanners, clicking, business as usual, until the front doors flew open. Shadow burst in like a missile locked on target, nearly dragging Jake off his feet as he barreled through the metal detector. Heads turned. A bailiff reached for his radio. "It's all right," Jake said quickly, holding up his badge. "K9 unit. He's tracking something. I don't know what yet." The bailiff looked skeptical. "You sure he's not just acting out?" Jake shook his head. "Shadow doesn't act out, ever." The dog's nails tapped rapidly across the marble floor as he weaved through the front hall. Ignoring startled clerks and curious attorneys, his nose twitched constantly, zeroing in on something only he could detect. Jake's mind raced. It wasn't narcotics. Canine sweeps had already cleared the building earlier. It wasn't explosives, either. No threats, no suspicious items reported. So what was he following? They didn't have to wonder long. Shadow made a hard turn toward Courtroom B, where Judge Lyle Monroe was overseeing a heated custody dispute. Jake knew that Courtroom was sealed due to the sensitivity of the case. But that didn't stop Shadow. He slammed his body against the doors, claws scraping. Body braced like a spring ready to launch. Jake caught up, tightening his grip. "Shadow, heel," he called firmly. The dog didn't respond. With a powerful shove, Shadow pushed the doors open, and in an instant, everything changed. Inside, the room was tense. Lawyers argued across the aisle. A social worker sat quietly near the back. And on a large bench at the center sat Lena, an 80-year-old girl with serious eyes and a cloud of dark curls. This was her final hearing. Today, the court would decide her future, another temporary placement, or, possibly, adoption into a permanent home. When the door burst open, everyone turned. Shadow darted down the aisle, a blur of motion. Jake followed, breathless, murmuring apologies as he passed stunned jurors and startled attorneys. "K9 unit, please remain seated. He's tracking something." Judge Monroe rose from the bench, eyebrows raised, gavel frozen mid-air. "Officer, what's going on?" "I'm not sure, Your Honor," Jake replied. "But he's onto something. He's never done this before." Shadow didn't wait for approval. He veered behind the judge's podium and disappeared underneath it. The entire courtroom fell silent. Jake rushed to the bench, heart racing. He dropped to his knees and gently lifted the hem of the judge's robe to look beneath the platform. What he saw took his breath away. A small bundle of blankets was nestled behind a wooden beam, shaking slightly. Breathing. A child. Curled up. In the crawlspace was a little girl, no more than 3 years old. The room erupted. Medical teams were called immediately. Court officers sprang into action. Judge Monroe recessed the hearing on the spot. Still gripping the leash, Jake carefully coaxed Shadow back as EMTs carried the child out. She clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest, her face streaked with tears. Her name, they would later learn, was Ava. She had been missing inside the courthouse for over 3 hours. Her grandmother had brought her in earlier that morning, and in the chaos of paperwork, Ava vanished. A quiet search had been underway, avoiding a full lockdown while hoping she was just misplaced. No one had expected this. No one but Shadow. As paramedics escorted Ava to safety, she clung to Shadow like he was her anchor in the storm. Lena, still seated on the courtroom bench, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She didn't say a word, but she noticed. She saw what everyone else had missed, how Shadow had found someone hidden in plain sight. And Jake, he couldn't stop watching Lena. Because while Ava was the one who had been rescued that day, something told him Lena's story was still unfolding. In fact, it might just be beginning. The courtroom had mostly emptied. Attorneys and officers spoke in hushed tones out in the hallway. Judge Monroe had retreated to her chambers, and Ava, now safely in the arms of her sobbing grandmother, was being escorted out by medics. But Lena Cruz remained where she was perched quietly on the bench, legs dangling, fingers laced in her lap. Her wide, watchful eyes followed every move Shadow made as he returned to Jake's side, his tail gently wagging now that the urgency had passed. Lena wasn't supposed to be the focus that day. She was just another case in a long docket. But fate had clearly decided otherwise. Jake stood near the doors, trying to process everything that had just taken place. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a dull ache in his head and a gnawing tension in his chest. Shadow leaned against his leg, thumping his tail with quiet satisfaction. Jake scratched behind his ears. "You really stirred things up today, didn't you?" Shadow gave a soft, pleased grunt. A bailiff approached and cleared his throat. "Officer Morrison, the judge would like to speak with you now." Jake blinked. "Is this about the hearing?" "She didn't say. Just asked for you and the dog." Jake glanced down at Shadow. "Well, partner, looks like we're not done yet." Judge Lea Monroe had presided over that bench for 16 years. She'd seen it all: drug trials, domestic cases, every imaginable heartbreak. She was known for keeping a cool head, even under pressure. But today had rattled even her. Her robe was draped over the back of a chair, and she cradled a ceramic mug labeled "World's Most Patient Woman." Jake had no doubt that wasn't self. Her silver hair was tied in a neat bun, and her expression, while composed, had softened. "Officer Morrison, Shadow, come in," she said gently. Jake removed his hat out of respect. "Apologies for the disruption, Your Honor." She waved it off. "Forget the formalities. That dog may have just saved a child's life. You don't apologize for that." Shadow took the opportunity to flop onto the carpet, tongue lolling out in lazy contentment. The judge smiled. "He's trained, but not uptight. I like that." Jake chuckled. "He's got a mind of his own, that's for sure." She nodded, then leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something. Has Shadow ever done anything like this before?" Jake shook his head. "Never. He's by the book. Most obedient canine I've ever worked with. But today, it was like he sensed something wrong. Before we were even close." Judge Monroe tapped her fingers lightly on her mug. I've always believed dogs pick up on things people can't. But I also believe in timing. She paused, thoughtful. That little girl was right there in my courtroom the whole time, and none of us knew. She studied Jake for a moment. Do you remember the girl in the gallery? The one who didn't flinch when your dog charged in? Jake frowned. The older girl. Yay, she stood out, calm, really calm. Her name's Lena Cruz, the judge said. She's been in the system 2 years. Lost her mother to an overdose. Father's in prison. She's bounced through 4 different foster homes. Today's hearing was to decide whether she'd be moved again or finally matched with a permanent placement. Jake didn't speak, but the tightness in his chest grew heavier. After the medics cleared Ava, Lena went straight to her, sat beside her, started speaking softly in Spanish. Gentle, like an older sister. That child calmed down faster than I've ever seen. The judge met his eyes. That's not something you forget. Outside the judge's chambers, Lena sat on a long bench, legs swinging slowly. One hand rested on Shadow's head, stroking his fur behind the ears. The same bailiff who'd escorted Jake stood nearby, though Lena didn't need supervision. She had a quiet strength more composed than many adults Jake had worked with. He crouched beside her. You doing okay? Lena nodded. He's soft, she said, giving Shadow another pat. He likes you, Jake said. Doesn't always happen. She offered a small, shy smile, but stayed quiet. You know, Jake added. What you did earlier talking to that little girl, that was kind. Not everyone would have thought to do that. Lena gave a half shrug. She looked scared. I know what that's like. Jake swallowed, words catching in his throat. Before he could respond, a couple approached. A man and a woman, early 40s. The woman had gentle eyes, and the man looked like he was holding back tears. They introduced themselves as the Martinez family. We were here for the hearing, the woman said. We've been hoping to adopt. Lena was recently matched with us. Jake stepped back as the couple knelt to speak to her. We saw what you did in there, Mr. Martinez said softly, and we just wanted to say. We saw you, Lena blinked. You saw what? We saw your heart. 3 days went by. Jake couldn't get it out of his mind. Shadow was back to normal eating kibble, chasing balls, snoozing in his usual corner. Like nothing unusual had happened, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He kept replaying that quiet moment Lena, reaching out to Ava. It wasn't for attention. It wasn't for praise. It was instinctive, natural, pure. It wasn't his place to step in. He knew that, but the feeling wouldn't go away, like there was something unfinished. So, he made a call to the courthouse and asked a question he never thought he'd ask. A week later, Lena's social worker invited him to stop by the foster center. He didn't wear his uniformed, just jeans, boots, and his usual jacket that still faintly smelled of dog treats. Lena was in the common room, helping a younger boy fit puzzle pieces together. She looked up when she saw him, a grin spreading across her face. You came, Jake nodded. Brought someone with me too. He gave a low whistle, and Shadow trotted in, tail already wagging. Lena lit up. They sat outside together at a picnic bench, the evening sun dipping low behind the fence. The breeze rustled the trees. Shadow sprawled on the ground beside them, eyes half closed. Jake cleared his throat. I asked your caseworker if I could check in. Just wanted to see how you're doing. I'm okay, Lena said. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez are really nice. They said I could choose a new middle name if I want, a new beginning. Jake smiled. Got any ideas? Lena looked at Shadow, then looked back at Jake. I was thinking, maybe Hope, Jake said, his voice catching in his throat. That's a strong name. Lena rested against the table, saying nothing. She just watched the dog sleeping peacefully, watched the sky deepen into dusk. It was a quiet moment, yet it carried more weight than words could express. Later, courthouse security footage would confirm that Ava had slipped into the courtroom just minutes before the session began. No one noticed her crawl beneath the bench for Shadow, and somehow, Lena knew too, not through scent, not from training, something deeper. She felt it. 2 weeks passed. During that time, headlines and social media posts began echoing the same phrase. The dog who broke protocol. Shadow's instinctive actions were praised across articles and news segments. Talk shows replayed the footage of him racing down the courtroom aisle. A reporter from Denver Morning News even called Jake, asking if Shadow could appear on live TV. Jake declined. Shadow wasn't in it for fame, he was a working dog. That day in court wasn't for show, was real at the precinct. Life hadn't slowed. There were still drug raids, school visits, and missing persons to investigate. But the courthouse moment lingered in Jake's mind, persistent, like static. Especially the look Lena had given Ava, like she saw something unspoken, something only the heart could understand. Jake hadn't grown up in the foster system, but he knew what it was like to feel invisible. His father had been in the military, strict and emotionally distant. His mother juggled 3 jobs to keep the family afloat. Nobody ever taught Jake how to open up. He learned to solve problems, then move on. But kids like Lena didn't always get to just move on. On a brisk Friday morning, Jake was loading up the K9 unit when his phone buzzed. A message from the courthouse liaison appeared. "You're invited. Judge Monroe requested you and Shadow specifically. Lena's adoption hearing. 2 p.m. Courtroom B." Jake stared at the message for a moment. Then he looked over at Shadow, waiting in the back seat, ears alert. "You ready to make an appearance, partner?" Shadow wagged his tail like he understood. Every word this time. Courtroom B felt different. Warmer. A vase of sunflowers brightened the windowsill. A handmade sign, "Welcome home, Lena," with glittery letters hung behind the judge's bench. The seats weren't filled with lawyers and caseworkers, they were filled with smiling faces. The Martinez family sat near the front, Susan in a royal blue cardigan, Michael in a gray blazer, both looking more nervous than they had at the custody hearing. Lena sat between them in a white dress stitched with tiny birds. In her hands, she held a stuffed animal, not a doll or a teddy bear, but a black dog with a toy badge around its neck. Jake entered quietly with Shadow, taking a seat near the back. They didn't want to draw attention, but that didn't last. "Officer Morrison," Judge Monroe called out, "and Officer Shadow, please come forward." Laughter rippled through the room. Jake blushed slightly, but Shadow stepped up proudly, tail wagging, like he belonged in a parade. Jake stopped at the railing. "Your Honor," Judge Monroe smiled warmly. "I wanted them here today. If it weren't for Officer Morrison's judgment and Shadow's instincts, we might have had a very different outcome in this courtroom." She looked toward Lena. "Miss Cruiswell, Miss Martinez, Noir, you ready?" Lena nodded. Monroe leaned in. "Any words before we begin?" Lena paused. Her eyes found Jake, then Shadow, then the couple beside her. "My mom used to say heroes don't always wear capes," she said. "Sometimes, they wear vests." The room fell silent. Then came the applause. After the ceremony and paperwork were complete, everyone gathered on the courthouse steps for pictures. Shadow stayed close to Lena in every shot, tail wagging, tongue out. The Martinez family brought a bone-shaped cake that read, "Thank you, Shadow," in white icing. Photographers captured the moment, but this wasn't a publicity stunt. It was something more intimate, something sacred. A girl had found her forever home, and a dog had helped her believe it was possible. That evening, Jake sat on his porch with a cold drink in hand, while Shadow gnawed on a peanut butter chew beside him. The sky turned a deep amber. Across the street, a neighbor strung Halloween lights around a fence post. Jake's phone buzzed again, this time a message from Susan Martinez. "Hi, Officer Morrison. Lena wanted to know if Shadow could visit her school next week. She's doing a presentation on heroes. Totally understand if it's not possible, just thought we'd ask." Jake smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Shadow would be honored." Then added, "He already thinks he's famous." That Monday morning, Jake pulled into Jefferson Elementary. Pumpkins lined the front lawn. A school officer waved him through, giving a cheerful thumbs up. Children had already gathered near the multi-purpose room, their eyes lighting up when they saw the police K9 unit. "Is that him?" one kid shouted. "That's the dog from the news. He broke into court like a superhero." Jake opened the car door, and Shadow stepped out calmly, tail wagging, unfazed by the swarm of second graders who treated him like a comic book legend. Inside the auditorium, a paper banner hung above the stage, "Heroes in Our Lives." Second grade presentation. Lena stood up front, holding a microphone with confidence. "This is Officer Shadow," she said. "He doesn't talk, but he listens better than most people. He found a missing girl. But more than that, he made me feel safe, freely safe, for the first time in a long time." Jake blinked hard, watching from the side of the stage. Shadow lay at Lena's feet, paws crossed, completely still as if he understood everything. Later, during a Q&A session, kids asked questions like, "Can Shadow fly? Does he like bacon? And if he breaks the rules, does he go to jail?" Jake stood beside Lena as she passed out dog-shaped cookies, answering their questions like a seasoned pro-dot. As they walked outside afterward, Lena tugged on Jake's sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did he pick me?" she asked. "Out of everyone." Jake thought for a moment. "I don't think Shadow picked you, Lena." She frowned slightly. "I think he just found you. Just like you found Ava. Just like good people find each other when the world gives them the chance." She didn't say anything, just nodded, like she understood. By the time Jake got home and let Shadow out of the cruiser that evening, 3 new emails had landed in his inbox. Local schools were requesting K9 visits, and a non-profit had left a voicemail about featuring Shadow in a charity calendar. Jake deleted them all. This story didn't belong in headlines or photo spreads. It belonged to Lena, to Ava, and to Shadow. Belonged to anyone who had ever gone unnoticed until someone finally saw them. That day hadn't involved flashing lights or emergency calls. No arrests, no drama, just a dog that listened, a girl who spoke up, and a family who said yes when it mattered most. Jake kept thinking, not all rescues happen in chaos. Some unfold in the stillness that follows. Shadow wasn't asleep. Jake recognized the signs. Most dogs twitch or let out soft snores when they're resting, but Shadow, curled up near the window, was motionless, ears perked, eyes open, chest rising just a bit too fast. He hadn't fully relaxed in 3 nights. Jake sat on the couch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, aimlessly flipping through channels. The warm light in the room did little to ease the unease in his chest. Outside, wind gusts rustled. Dry leaves down the street in scratchy bursts. He finally muted the TV. "You're wound up again, huh?" he said quietly. Shadow turned his head, acknowledging the voice, but didn't move. Jake leaned forward. "What is it?" His voice was softer now. "You haven't been like this since." He didn't finish the sentence out loud, just thought. Since the courthouse. At first, he'd chalked it up to lingering tension. Shadow had never broken protocol before. As a canine officer, he was trained for precisions, sniffing out drugs, explosives, and missing persons with near-perfect reliability. But what happened in that courtroom didn't line up with anything in the manuals. And now, this odd restlessness. Jake couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't about the outside world. Shadow seemed to be searching inward for something just out of reach. Jake opened his phone and started a new note. He typed, "Residual," then added, "Unresolved. Could Shadow know something I don't?" He stared at the words before locking his phone and setting it aside. Maybe he was over, or maybe not. 2 days later, he and Shadow were scheduled for a visit to the Jefferson County Youth Center, halfway home for teens in the foster system. Lena had suggested it after her school presentation. "They have dogs in some group homes," she'd said, "but not like Shadow. He makes people feel safe." Jake agreed, though part of him still felt unsettled. The center sat on the edge of Denver's older neighborhood, a brick building with security bars on the windows and a tall metal fence out front. Inside, the rec room was painted in calming greens and blues, a quiet effort to make the place feel more like a school than a detention center. 10 teens were seated in a semi-circular hoodies, flannel, slouched postures. A few kept their eyes on the floor. One girl, maybe 15, had streaks of color in her hair and a long scar on her cheek. Her name tag read Maya. Jake introduced himself and gave the usual rundown how canine teams worked, how dogs were trained, how trust between handler and dog was built. Most of the teens stayed quiet. Shadow, as always, let his presence speak for itself. He moved slowly, calmly, scanning the room with his nose low and tail gently wagging. When he reached Maya, he stopped, sat, and stared at her. She blinked. He's just, looking at me. Jake smiled. He thinks you're interesting. Dogs don't usually, well, Shadow's not most dogs. After a few beats, Maya reached out and touched the top of his head. Something shifted, in the room postures relaxed, tension dissolved. By the end of the visit, 2 boys were sprawled on the floor, using Shadow as a pillow. Maya was talking about adopting a dog when she aged out of the system. Jake leaned quietly against the back wall, watching, but again, that gnawing feeling returned. On the way out, one of the counselors, Angela, walked Jake to the cruiser. He's amazing, she said, eyes on Shadow. There's something different about him. Jake nodded. We've been through a lot. Angela hesitated. Mind if I ask you something strange? Jake raised an eyebrow. Sure. Did he react to one of our girls? Maya, the older one. He just stared at her. Usually animals shy away from her, like they sense something. But not him. Jake considered. Shadow doesn't fixate without a reason. Angela nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Back home, Jake couldn't shake it. He pulled up the courthouse body cam footage again. It was borderline obsessive at this point, but he kept seeing new details. This time, he started from the moment the doors opened. Ava crawled beneath the bench. Shadow, focused and determined, pulled forward. Lena sat in her seat, watching, but just as Shadow honed in on Ava, something flickered across the screen, a tiny hesitation. Jake paused the video, rewound, zoomed there for a fraction of a second. Shadow looked at Lena. Then he dove under the bench. Jake sat back slowly, rubbing his jaw. That wasn't instinct. That was something else. The next day, Jake stopped by the Martinez house. Lena was raking leaves with Susan in the backyard. As soon as Shadow bounded through the gate, Lena's face lit up. Hey partner, Jake grinned. I owe you thanks. The youth center loved the visit. Maya's tough, Lena said, but she liked him. Jake's smile softened. Yeah, she did. Then he shifted. Can I ask you something? Sure. That day, in the courtroom, did you know what was happening before Shadow ran? And Lena paused. I saw Ava come in, thought maybe she was with someone. But when I didn't see her again, I figured she left. But you weren't surprised when Shadow found her. Lena's hand loosened on the rake. No, she admitted. Then let it drop. A quiet stretch passed. She sat down on the porch steps, scratching behind Shadow's ears. I've been in a lot of places where people just don't see you, she said, but dogs do. Jake sat beside her. I think you see things too. She looked away. Maybe. That night, Jake opened a new note on his phone. Shadow isn't reacting to what's present. He's reacting to what's missing. Then he added, what if something in that courtroom is still unresolved? He put the phone down, the thoughts sitting heavy in the silence. He didn't sleep. Shadow didn't sleep either. The following day, Jake made his way to the Jefferson County Courthouse. He wasn't there on duty, nor for any court proceedings. He was simply there to observe. He wandered the halls, Shadow walking calmly beside him on a loose lead. They weren't pursuing anything specific, just listening. Just being present. Then it happened. As they passed Courtroom D, Shadow halted. His body stiffened, ears sharply pointed forward. He let out a low, urgent whine, exactly the same sound he'd made the day he discovered Ava. Jake crouched beside him. What do you smell? He asked. Shadow moved toward a vent near the baseboard, dusty old metal with a loose grate. Jake took out his multi-tool, unscrewed the panel, and aimed his flashlight into the darkness. The space looked empty, but Shadow stayed locked in place, nose pressed forward. Body quivering. Jake reached in deeper and brushed against something soft fabric. He pulled it out slowly. A small, faded piece of blue cloth, child-sized, coated in dust and dirt. There was a single delicate letter stitched into the hem. E. Jake froze. E. ... like Emma. He never finished the thought. Shadow suddenly growled, low and rough. Something had changed, something wasn't right. The cloth was no bigger than a hand towel, worn thin and grimy with age. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as a forgotten scrap, but it wasn't just tossed there. Shadow hadn't simply noticed it, he had locked onto it, and by now, Jake had learned that his dog's instincts were rarely wrong. He turned the cloth over slowly in his hands, feeling its worn softness. The letter in the corner was faint under the dust, but unmistakable. E. Just one initial, but to Jake, it felt like a message deliberately left behind, something meant to be found. He handed it over to the courthouse evidence team. Tests came back, no traces of blood, no DNA match. But the fabric's age suggested it had been sealed in that vent for years, decades. Even not weeks, not months. That was the part Jake couldn't shake. If the cloth didn't belong to Ava, then who had left it there? Later that night, Jake sat at his kitchen table, the cloth spread out over a clean towel beneath a glowing magnifying lamp. Shadow lay nearby, quietly watching him. Jake had spent hours combing through courthouse records, old case files, and missing persons reports, anything mentioning a child with a name starting with E. Then he found it. A sealed file from 2001. Case number 02391. Name, Eloise Gardner. Jake opened the document. Most of it was heavily redacted names, blacked out, sections missing. But certain details stood out. Female, 6 years old. Last seen inside the Jefferson County Courthouse. Disappeared during a custody hearing in Courtroom D. Case closed without resolution. Presumed abducted. Never found. Jake leaned back in his chair, pulse racing. Shadow lifted his head. Eloise. Jake whispered. The cloth. The vent. Courtroom D. It hadn't been a coincidence. Jake forwarded the case file to Judge Monroe with a brief message. I think this needs to be revisited. She replied 12 minutes later. Come to chambers first thing tomorrow. Bring Shadow. At sunrise, Jake and Shadow walked the courthouse halls once more. The setting hadn't changed, polished stone floors, humming lights overhead, aging wooden benches, but to Jake, it all felt different now, like a crime scene cleverly disguised as a public building. Judge Monroe was already in chambers. Coffee in hand, the printed file on her desk. I was here in 2001, she said quietly. Just started on the bench. But I wasn't the presiding judge. That was clean. He's retired now. She placed the file in front of Jake. Do you believe she was taken? Jake nodded. I think someone used that courtroom to make a child disappear. And I think Shadow just uncovered the first trace of her in 23 years. Monroe frowned. But why now? Why resurface after all this time? Jake hesitated. Maybe it never really went away. They returned together to Courtroom D again. Jake let Shadow take the lead. The dog walked straight to the vent and gave another low whine. Jake crouched, shining his light into the ductwork. Nothing at first, just dust and faint scratch marks. Then, something caught the light. Jake reached in and pulled out a small silver locket. The hinge was rusted, but intact. Inside was a tiny photograph. A girl with freckles and wide eyes. On the inner cover, written in marker, was a name, Eloise, age 6. Monroe raised a hand to her mouth. Jake remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. Shadow sat completely still, as though he understood the gravity of what they had found. Finally, Monroe spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to reopen this case. By midday, cold case detectives had arrived. Jake stayed to assist. He watched them dust for prints, scan the vents, dig through decades-old files. But the courthouse's age posed challenges. No camera footage. From 2001, No usable prints. No sign of forced entry or exit. One detail, however, wouldn't leave Jake's mind. Every record confirmed that the girl had been inside Courtroom D, but none of the documents identified who had brought her there that day. No parent, no guardian, no listed attorney, no names. That evening, Jake sat on the porch. Monroe joined him. She had insisted. "I can't get it out of my head," she said softly. Who would do something like that in a courthouse? Jake took a slow sip from his coffee mug. "I don't know. But I think they either worked here or still do." Monroe turned to look at him, startled. "You think they're still around?" Jake nodded slowly. "That cloth, it wasn't dropped, it was planted. Someone knew a dog like Shadow might come looking. They didn't want him finding anything else." She glanced toward Shadow, who was dozing with his head on the porch step. "Then he's not just a hero," she said quietly. "He's a threat to whoever's behind this." That same night, a call came in to dispatch. An anonymous tip. A low, distorted voice. 15 seconds, you should have left it buried. Then, silence. No number, no trace. Dispatch contacted Jake. Within minutes, he didn't sleep that night. Neither did Shadow. The next morning, Jake returned to the courthouse with one goal: to find out exactly who had been in the building the day Eloise vanished. He pored over judge rosters, custody schedules, bailiff assignments, intern records, nothing unusual, until he reached the janitorial logs. Only one name was listed for building maintenance, that day: Caleb Rowe. Employed since 1998, still on staff. Assigned to the South Corridor, including Courtroom D, Jake felt his stomach sink. He used to see that man in the hallway every week, quiet, always in the same brown custodial uniform, head down, polite nod. Jake had never spoken a word to him. As he printed the log and slipped it into his folder, he stood to leave, but the moment he reached for the doorknob, Shadow stirred. The dog tensed, ears alert, a low growl rising from his chest. Jake froze. There was a faint movement outside. Then a voice, digging into old ghosts. "Officer Morrison." Jake turned. Caleb Rose was in the hall, mop bucket by his side, eyes fixed on him. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was pointed. "I hear you've been digging." Jake kept his voice even. "Just reviewing some paperwork." Caleb's lip twitched. "Some things are better left buried. People tend to forget that." Jake didn't react. Shadow didn't either. Caleb gave a thin, hollow smile before pushing his bucket down the corridor, the wheels squeaking with each step. Jake crouched beside Shadow. "He's not exactly our biggest fan," he whispered. Shadow licked his lips. Jake opened his phone. There was work to be done. And the janitor's words kept ringing in his head. They weren't casual. They were precise, purposeful, cold. As the sound of the mop faded, Jake realized that wasn't a warning. He murmured, "That was a confession." He went straight to Judge Monroe's office. Within the hour, she quietly signed off on a limited warrant to inspect Caleb's assigned custodial areas, specifically the south wing of the courthouse, including the maintenance rooms and basement access. Jake didn't waste time. He geared up, called in a forensic tech, and brought Shadow. They entered the basement at 6:43 p.m. The air was stale, the corridor dim, and lined with exposed piping. The walls were thick with decades of dust. The janitor's room sat tucked away at the far end, an old metal door with a rusted clipboard screwed into it. Jake used a key pulled from the security office. The lock gave with a dry creak. Inside were standard supplies: bleach gloves, brooms, a dusty radio. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Shadow's attention. It was the floor. Shadow went still, then moved cautiously toward the far corner. He sniffed once, then again, and began circling. Then he sat, staring at a section of linoleum that didn't quite match the rest. Jake knelt beside him. The edges were barely visible, but they were there. He used his knife to pry one up. Underneath, his stomach turned. Wooden boards, hand-cut and warped with age, nailed shut. And beneath that, a faint, unmistakable odor, they called it in. Within the hour, the boards had been removed. Beneath them, a shallow cavity no deeper than 3 feet. Inside were fragments, a tattered child's blanket, pieces of bone, and a single pink shoe, its sole worn, nearly smooth. Jake stepped back as the forensic team moved in. Cameras clicked. Shadow didn't bark or growl, he simply lay down beside the opening, curling his body protectively around it. DNA results would take time, but everyone already knew. It was Eloise Gardner, the girl who went missing in 2001. The child with the stitched E on her cloth. The one no one remembered. Jake clenched his fists as he walked the edge of the basement. How many people had passed through that building in the last 23 years, unaware of what lay beneath their feet? How many other children had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed except by one dog? Caleb Rose didn't return to work the next day or the day after. When investigators reached his apartment, it had been wiped clean, but Shadow picked up on something. A folded piece of newspaper tucked into the heating vent. The article was from 2001, a clipping about Eloise's disappearance. Scrawled across it in shaky pen were the words, "You should have stopped digging." The manhunt began before sundown. Jake barely slept that week. Neither did Shadow. They chased every lead: gas stations, bus terminals, pawnshops. But it was like Caleb had evaporated. Until day 5. That afternoon, Lena came home from school and froze in her driveway. Parked just 3 houses down was a brown custodial van. No labels, engine cold. Susan called Jake right away. By the time he arrived, Caleb was already gone, but Shadow picked up the scent on the sidewalk, which led into the woods behind the neighborhood. Jake called for backup. He clipped on Shadow's leash. "Let's finish this." They moved quickly. The trail twisted half a mile into the trees, then dipped toward an old irrigation canal. There, in a clearing, they found Caleb's bag. Inside were canned food, gloves, rope, and an old photo. A girl sitting in a courthouse gallery. Eloise. Jake's heart tightened. Shadow pulled harder. 20 minutes later, they spotted him hunched, low in a gully, hidden behind thick brush. Dirt streaked his hands. His eyes were hollow, lips dry, and cracked. Jake raised his weapon. "Hands where I can see them." Caleb didn't resist. He sat quietly, looking drained. "You weren't supposed to find her," he muttered. Jake's voice was steady. "Why, Caleb?" He stared at the ground. "She screamed. I told her to stop. I only meant to scare her." "I didn't mean." Jake cut him off. "You hid her for 23 years. Caleb nodded slowly. "I figured if no one found her, no one would remember." Shadow stood frozen beside Jake, his posture rigid. Jake inhaled sharply. "She was remembered. And now she's found." The arrest made headlines across the country. Cold case solved by K9. Hero dog uncovers truth after 23 years. Justice, at last. For Eloise. Jake turned down every interview. No press, no spotlight. The story didn't belong to the media. It belonged to her. 1 week later, a small memorial was held on the courthouse steps. Judge Monroe led the ceremony. Distant relatives of Eloise were located and brought in. Flowers formed a ring. A plaque was placed outside Courtroom. It read, "In memory of Eloise Gardner, a child whose voice was lost, but never forgotten." Shadow stood beside it the entire time, still silent, as if guarding her one last time. Lena stood before the small crowd and read a letter she had written herself. Her voice was steady, but her words struck deep. She ended with, "Eloise, I didn't know you, but I felt you. We all did. You mattered." No one left with dry eyes, not even Jake. That evening, back at home, Jake opened the door and unclipped Shadow's leash. The dog wandered into the living room, circled once, then for the first time in weeks, curled up and fell into a peaceful sleep. No pacing, no whines, no restless watching. Jake stood there quietly, watching the rise and fall of Shadow's breathing. Then he whispered, "Good job, partner." A month later, Shadow was officially retired from active duty. Not because he was no longer able, but because he'd earned his rest. Jake kept him close, no longer as a working canine, but as family. He still wore his vest for school visits and courthouse events, but his days of chasing suspects and searching dark places were over. He had done more than anyone ever expected. Lena visited every Friday after school. Sometimes they baked together. Other times, they just sat on the porch with Shadow nestled between them. One afternoon she asked, "Do you think dogs have feelings like people?" Jake paused. "I think they have something better. They don't need words, they just understand." Lena smiled. "I think Shadow knew what I was feeling before I did." Jake nodded. "He's good at that." As the sun dipped behind the trees and Shadow dozed quietly by the door, one truth stood out. This wasn't just the tale of a rescue dog, it was a story about what happens when someone listens, not just to words, but to instincts, to the quiet, to the things we often overlook, because sometimes, the real heroes don't show up with sirens or spotlights. They keep going, quietly, relentlessly, until even the smallest voice is finally heard. Thank you for walking through this journey with us. From Lena's quiet strength, to Shadow's unwavering loyalty, to Eloise's long overdue justice, was never just about solving a mystery, it was about healing, about being seen, and about the quiet, enduring power of compassion.